Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Jesse Vanek and I am the Director of Development at Historic Deerfield. We have a very special evening in store for you tonight, and I am so thrilled to know that we have hundreds of our dearest friends and supporters from around the country and indeed around the world tuning in to celebrate with us this evening. Tonight's program is scheduled to last about an hour and a half, but before we get into it, let me review several Zoom features we are using tonight. We automatically muted everyone, so you do not have to worry about background noise. We also can't see you, so feel free to get up whenever you need to. This program has closed captioning available. In order to have closed captioning available in the recording, it has to be on during the program. If you are using a PC, closed captioning appears automatically. To turn this feature off, go to the bottom of your Zoom menu bar, look for the live transcript closed caption icon. Click on that icon, and then click Hide Subtitle. For Mac users, if you want to use closed captioning, you need to turn it on. Click Show Subtitle. The closed captioning feature has an 80% accuracy rate, so it's good, but it's not perfect. And sorry about that. Please feel free to send me an email after the event with your favorite odd, humorous, or just plain weird misinterpretations it automatically generates. We have also turned on the chat feature, and I encourage you to feel free to use it to interact with your fellow audience members. It's not quite the same as being together in Deerfield, obviously, but there's an excellent chance that those friends you haven't seen in far too long are also here with us tonight. So feel free to reach out to each other. Just remember that your chat messages will be visible to all participants. This program will be recorded and will be available for 2 weeks after the event. So if you find yourself distracted by socializing, you'll have a chance to come back and rewatch any portions you might have missed. If you need help, please feel free to email Onward at historic-deerfield.org for assistance. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on with the show. I am so pleased that you are all here to join us tonight to celebrate one of the sweetest, most charming, most dynamic, most elegant, most thoughtful, and frankly, the most capable advocate and preservation hero Historic Deerfield has ever known, your friend and mine, Philip Zea. I must confess we had planned to spend the entire evening showering Betsy with our affection, but she insisted that we let her husband, Phil, share a little bit of the spotlight. And who am I to argue with Betsy? The trouble is, I don't actually know very much about this Phil guy, so I put out a call for more information. Not only did several of Phil's friends take my calls, but wow, did they have some really wonderful things to say about him when we interviewed them. We'll be hearing from them throughout the event tonight. I'm teasing, of course, but for those of you who don't know, Historic Deerfield's president and CEO, Phil Zea, is due to retire this Friday after a long and storied career spanning nearly 4 decades. And I'm very excited that you have tuned in to join in the celebration. Before we get this train rolling, I thought we might start with a little poll to test your knowledge of Phil's career. So, at which of the following organizations has Phil worked over the course of his career? Is it A, Historic Deerfield, B, Colonial Williamsburg, C, Old Sturbridge Village, D, Historic New England, or E, all of the above? Go ahead and mark your choice and then click Submit, and we'll see how we all did. I'll give it a few minutes, or a few seconds rather, here, and then we'll reveal the answers. Looks like votes are coming in fast and furious here. Great, another minute, another second or so, and we can show the results. Excellent. If you chose E, all of the above, you're right. Excellent. So, as I mentioned, we are so pleased to be honoring Phil tonight. He knows this event is happening, and my co-conspirators and I even convinced him to sit in front of a camera to be interviewed, but he doesn't really know what we've actually been up to these past few weeks. So we are thrilled to be sharing this evening with Phil and Betsy both, and we are equally pleased to be sharing in the fun with all of you. I understand Phil and Betsy may even pop into the chat too, so don't hesitate to shower them both with your love and affection. In addition to interviewing a few of Phil's friends, we also sat down with Phil himself to learn a bit more about Deerfield, his thoughts on why Deerfield matters, and the winding path he took to where he is today, which is to say, a highly respected and deeply knowledgeable scholar, a beloved leader who has left a deep and lasting impact on the organization where he has worked for 4 decades, and a friend and colleague who sits on the very cusp of a much-deserved retirement. This evening, we'll take a spin through the decades since Phil first came to Historic Deerfield as a participant in HD's Summer Fellowship Program in 1973. And since we know that it's been a while since many of you have been able to travel outside your hometown, let alone to Deerfield, we will be sure to share the many visual treasures of this fantastic place as we go along. So let's start with a bit of background on who Phil is and why Deerfield matters, shall we?
I love history, and I love cultural history in particular. For me, it's the whole picture. It's everything feeds into culture at the end of the day, which is to say one's beliefs, one's attitudes, what you like, what you don't like, what you believe, what you don't believe. So I've been on that track for a long time, and a place like Deerfield is perfect for that because, as you know, it's so multifaceted. There's a little sliver of almost any topic here in Deerfield that we can dissect as many times over as someone wishes.
Deerfield exudes a sense of place that is truly special, unlike any other place I've been in this country. Deerfield is authentic. Deerfield is real. Deerfield embodies layers of history that I truly believe tell the story of America in a very special way.
It's prismatic, and it takes us right up to the present. In fact, here in Deerfield, we think about, when is history? And for us, it begins yesterday and goes back for, in our case, about 12,000 years of human habitation. And it's all really, really interesting.
When you turn the corner, I come from the south, and when I drive in, it's a different world. The past is still with us today.
My introduction to the field, the 1973 Historic Deerfield Summer Fellowship Program. I was a junior at Wesleyan at that point, or just finished my junior year, and came here. The program, which we still offer for college undergraduates, has been in business since 1956. So I was thrilled to be here and to meet my fellow fellows and to learn that what I was interested in wasn't entirely oddball and off the mark, because my 7 newfound friends were in the same boat. So it was, in a way, it was a little like group therapy, and we went forward from there.
I've known Phil since probably a little more than 35 years. I met him first when he became a student at the University of Connecticut Old Sturbridge Village Master's Program. I was working at the village as a curator, and he was a student in one of our first classes.
I worked in the curatorial department, and more specifically for Jane Nylander, who has been a great mentor for me all along the way.
When you see an interest and a talent and a recognition and energy in someone like Phil, it's wonderful to be able to help encourage and help that flower. He went to work at the New Hampshire Historical Society for a while, and then he went to winter tour as a graduate student for another master's degree, which took 2 years.
Then I worked in Boston briefly for Brock Jobe on a book project that I could help out at that point.
Phil's contribution to the decorative arts field and to the field of history museums in general are enormous. He is one of the leading voices in the study of American decorative arts, real strength in the New England area, but equal interests for him in materials from the Mid-Atlantic and from the South.
We have a lot of shared interest. We both love American and European decorative arts and ethnographic art. Phil is very, very interested in that subject. And we also have tons of mutual friends in the museum world, the collector community, the trade. So there's never a loss of anything to talk about when we get together.
He's one of the few who take that broad approach. So there are plenty of examples of his scholarship on pewter, on clocks, on furniture, but he carries it out to the full picture, all the way through the buildings, the landscapes, the history. He's one of those people that you think of first when you start having questions about something in this field.
Because with Phil, I know I'll always come away smarter because he's just so knowledgeable about such a breadth of subjects. I'll learn to ask better questions because he always asks the right questions of objects and their place in history and culture. And I'll come away with a lot of laughs because he has a tremendous sense of humor.
And after that, he came to Deerfield as his first curatorial position. Don hired him as assistant curator because Deerfield's curatorial position was held, as you probably know, for a very long time by Peter Spang, whom the Flints had invited to become the founding curator at the end of the 1950s. And Peter was there until his retirement, probably 40 years later.
And then came here as assistant curator in 1981, became chief curator at the end of 1985, worked until 1999, 18 years, and then I left never to return.
Never to return, or so he thought. With that as background, let's now take a ride through the decades and see if we can touch on some of the highlights at Deerfield and in Phil's career as we go. We'll move in roughly chronological order, but as you'll see, time has a way of winding around and back onto itself. So don't be surprised if we take some back roads and enjoy the scenery along the way. So let's have some fun and kick it off with the 80s, shall we? Don't you just love seeing Phil in that slick 80s attire? To help us along in this journey through the decades, I have asked Historic Deerfield's distinguished and long-serving Senior Vice President, Ann Lanning, to join us on this journey. Ann has recently agreed to serve as interim president until Phil's successor, John Davis, starts this fall. Good evening, Ann.
Thank you, Jesse. It's a pleasure to join everyone tonight in celebrating Phil's career and his many accomplishments.
And you've been with Historic Deerfield since 1986, almost as long as Phil. So you are our institutional memory and the perfect person to lead us on this trip through time tonight. How about we put on some images of Deerfield to remind folks just how special this place is and encourage everyone to start planning their next trip to visit us. And you can set the context for us as we look back on the big accomplishments of the 80s.
Phil was appointed assistant curator at Historic Deerfield in 1981 and began working with Peter Spang, the museum's founding curator, who had already been at the museum for over 20 years. From day one, it looked like Phil set the bar high for what he wanted to accomplish, and the pace was fast. It makes you wonder if he ever slept. Plus, we need to remember that during this time, personal computers were rare, there was no email or smartphones. Historic Deerfield had a centralized computer system that was a glorified word processor that Phil and the staff used to type research notes and craft articles. We could bold, underline, italicize, and cut and paste. That was our technology. An early and important project for Phil involved working on the team that planned the landmark exhibition, The Great River, Art and Society of the Connecticut Valley, 1635 to 1820. The project was under the direction of Bill Hosley, curator at the Wadsworth Athenaeum at the time, and like Phil, a former Historic Deerfield Summer Fellow. In order to understand the cultural history and material culture of the Connecticut River Valley, curators like Phil conducted extensive field research, going to museums, historical societies, and historic house museums in towns all throughout the valley. They examined thousands of objects, as well as manuscripts, account books, and other documentary evidence. The team produced a seminal catalog that to this day is still the go-to resource for learning about art and culture in the Connecticut Valley. During the 80s, Phil experimented with organizing exhibitions in the historic houses. The Wright House became a permanent gallery for furniture exhibitions, starting first with the installation of the George Alfred Cluett collection, then the Hearst collection of American furniture, and now there's an exhibition there that explores 150 years of furniture making in Western Massachusetts. I arrived in Deerfield in August of 1986, just in time to be part of the team that worked on the reinterpretation of the Wells Thorne House. The goal was to show visitors how the community changed over the course of 125 years. And this required that each of the 7 rooms depict a specific period of time. It was an incredibly exciting project because this was the first time staff used probate inventories from Deerfield and surrounding towns to understand how interiors were furnished. The inventories were analyzed in order to get a sense of what was typical in terms of furnishings for each time period. Phil was the project leader, and I remember thinking to myself, how does he know so much about the Valley? He had a comprehensive knowledge of New England history, material culture, and a deep sense of place. His ability to tease out every last bit of information that an object could reveal about the pre-industrial past was both masterful and inspiring. It was fun when Phil scheduled a number of our planning meetings in the Wells Thorne House, probably to keep our collective creative juices flowing. When the project was completed, Phil organized a one-day symposium to share what the staff had learned from the project with colleagues in the museum field. And now, 35 years later, I can say, throughout Phil's career, he has shown a strong commitment to the field in sharing his knowledge, research, and experiences. And now let's hear from several of Phil's colleagues about their observations regarding his curatorial expertise and scholarship.
Don Friery was the CEO. He hired me in 1981, and he'd been the director of education here at Historic Deerfield and ran the summer fellowship program when I was a student. So I was delighted to come here and work for Don. But what was different then is basically a matter of scale. When we did have a staff meeting, which is, say, a staff meeting of all the full-time employees, we could fit in his office and, around the perimeter of the room so he could keep an eye on us. So Deerfield in 1981 was more personal, more intimate. The Henry and Helen Flint, who founded Historic Deerfield, Mrs. Flint was still alive at that point, but it was still emerging as their private enterprise going public, and that's what Don did. He brought it into the present and began to professionalize the place. So we hired 3 or 4 people in 1987 to expand the project, and those were all great hires, and we've gone forward from there.
I first heard of Phil in the early 1980s when I had just started my museum career at the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And Phil was one of a handful of Winter students who were making big waves in the decorative arts field. Phil's notoriety initially came from great lectures and a raft of publications, essays in old-time New England, proceedings of the Dublin Seminar, his wonderful article on rural furniture in Spinea's Colonial Furniture Catalog, just fantastic accomplishments for somebody of Phil's age. And we came to know of each other, and he invited me to speak at Historic Deerfield in the mid-'80s, and I think that was where we first met, and have had a great friendship ever since.
Phil's curatorial expertise is very, very broad. He really wants to understand and know all aspects of a collection. It's everything from a teaspoon to a piece of architectural detail to, for him, of great interest, a tall case clock. He's not just interested in the cabinet making and what makes the clock tick, but interested in all the details. And he saw to expand the collections in new areas and to refine them. There were large numbers of things that had been collected because they were beautiful, but they didn't necessarily relate to the Connecticut Valley interpretation at Deerfield. But he helped to sharpen the focus, I think, at that point in time, and set the wheels in motion for new kinds of exhibitions and programming.
Phil and I both began our professional lives as furniture curators, and we met at a conference in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery, and instantly had that furniture language that only furniture nerds can share, and immediately respected him. There's a whole vocabulary that goes with the furniture world, and many of these terms are words that the average intelligent person never hears otherwise, or hears in a different context, like ears, splats, ankles, skirts. And so if somebody is listening to two furniture heads have a conversation, it can sound a little weird. Wow, did you see the ears on that? It's a little peculiar.
I'd love to see Phil take a deep dive into colonial Newport furniture. I think the article he wrote on French influences in Newport is one of the best cultural studies of that city's furniture production that's ever been produced.
So full of knowledge, so interested in sharing everything, so interested in knowing what you thought. Just knew he was a great guy from the very beginning.
See, I told you Phil's friends had some wonderful things to say about him. I know that Phil and Betsy are watching along with us tonight, and I know that while Phil appreciates these kind words, he's also a very humble guy who probably wonders whether we're actually talking about someone else. So let's put sincerity on hold for a moment and see if we can give Phil some great retirement advice instead, shall we? So the rumor around Deerfield is that Phil is thinking about starting a band. That's right, he's putting down the powder horns and he's picking up an electric guitar, but he doesn't know what to call the band. So let's vote on a name. What is the name of the band that Phil is going to start when he retires? Is it A, Fabulous Phil and the Federalists? Is it B, the Clock Watchers? Is it C, Easy Peasy and the Flint Nappers, with a Y, of course? And is it D, New Hampshire Sampler? I'll give everyone a few seconds to vote, and after you voted, feel free to add your own comments and suggestions for retirement band names in the chat box. Votes are coming in fast and furious now. We'll give it about 5 more seconds here. All right. So there it is, Fabulous Phil and the Federalists. Fantastic. All right, well, let's keep things rolling on to the 90s, shall we?
Let's keep the Zea tradition from the 80s going. Bar high, pace fast. At the start of the 90s, under the direction of Bill Flint, the masterful restoration of the Williams House was completed. For the staff, it was exciting to see the house transform back to its earlier features, guided by Bill's extensive knowledge of New England architectural building traditions and by the work of 2 extraordinarily talented restoration carpenters on our staff. The 14-room house was turned over to Phil in the curatorial department to furnish and interpret. The project was a wonderful counterpoint to the Wells Thorne House because it focused on 1 family and 1 probate inventory. Phil served as project director and led the research and interpretation effort with the curatorial department staff. Phil identified objects in the collection that were appropriate for the time period and the family's economic position within the community. He also had to generate a list of objects that needed to be acquired. A particular challenge for Phil was that that the probate inventory listed 16 flag bottom chairs in the north parlor. Where would we ever find 16 identical chairs? Phil, always ready for a challenge, kept looking, and one day found a set of 12 chairs at a country auction. Other challenges included finding a period-appropriate cook stove for the kitchen and finding ways to make all 6 bed chambers and a storage room on the second floor interesting, all of which we did. The house opened to the public in 1993 and still looks good 28 years later, thanks to Phil and the staff. It's a bit astonishing how many catalogs and articles Phil published throughout the decade. In 1992, Phil and Suzanne Flint, former curator at the Memorial Hall Museum in Deerfield, published a catalog titled Hadley Chests that accompanied a traveling exhibition. Joint chests are a particular research interest of Phil's and the subject of his master's thesis. He published Clockmaking in New England with Robert Cheney in 1992, The Dunlap Cabinet Makers, A Tradition in Craftsmanship with Donald Dunlap in 1994, and Pursuing Refinement in Rural New England, 1750 to 1850 in 1998. The Flint Center of Early New England Life opened in the fall of 1998, following a successful capital campaign to support the building's design and construction. Phil was on the building committee to help ensure that the galleries, the workspaces, and the offices met our needs. The Flint Center provided staff with opportunities to plan and open changing exhibitions in a state-of-the-art building, open a visible storage gallery, solve long-standing collection storage issues, have object workrooms, a photo studio, as well as individual offices for 9 people. Phil curated the inaugural exhibition, Pursuing Refinement in Rural New England. He applied the metaphor of theater as the organizing principle of the show, based on the idea that refinement required public performance to secure approval. Sections of the show were titled The Cast, The Plot, The Stage and Scenery, The Props, The Rehearsal, and The Play. The exhibition was simply brilliant. In hindsight, I guess we should have anticipated his next move, but it was a shock when Phil left for Colonial Williamsburg. What wasn't surprising is how successful he was in his new position, curating Southern furniture. I always held out hope that Phil would return. Let's hear from Phil and his colleagues about the Williams House project and his leadership in developing the Flint Center as a state-of-the-art facility for historic Deerfield.
One of the things working with Phil always amazed me was the surprises he could pull out of that extraordinary treasure trove of knowledge that he has, of the finest little detail or the most unhonored or unrecognized craftsman or object. He will know some connection that will enrich whatever the current topic is.
We did a project that took a decade or so, because why not? We needed to raise the money, and we wanted to use the process of discovering what this house could tell us as a public feature itself. And I'm referring to the Williams House, which we finished, opened or reopened to the public in the mid-90s. And the purpose of that was to take a specific household as documented by a detailed probate inventory of a man named Hinsdale Williams, which is dated to 1838, and see how detailed we could make it. Could we, right down to the fly specks, recreate that setting as a platform for understanding what defined his world, what defined his wife and his kids' worlds, and who passed through there at any point in time. Several of us worked on that project, and I think we aced it. It's still fun for me to go through that house and reflect, it's not about individual objects, it's about how they all come together to make an enticing statement. So if history is a time machine, that's the kind of place, that's the kind of machine you want to get on to understand yourself through the people who've gone before. And that's what I love about history, and specifically cultural history. And after you perfect that, you can do it with individual objects. Now I'm speaking as a curator, which I used to be, but you can dive into not just the character or characteristics of an object, but into its very corpus and understand all that's interesting about it.
Phil has been absolutely essential in the way that Historic Deerfield has expanded and developed. And the most dramatic and obvious way for anyone to see is in the creation of the Flint Center and the establishment both of changing exhibitions, permanent exhibitions, taking over the entire entrance hall as an exhibition gallery, and then planning elaborate and engaging programs in the center and elsewhere, and developing the museum's attic to provide a display space for what's now 80% of that wonderful collection.
We implemented a system of visible storage so that most of the 30,000 some objects in the collection of Historic Deerfield, which are not on display in the historic houses, can be seen by visiting what we call the attic. The Flint Center also has rotating exhibition space so that we have 2 semi-permanent galleries as well as a rotating gallery. And Phil really led the charge on raising the funds and executing the construction of that building.
In 1999, we had just finished and opened a few months before the Flint Center of Early New England Life, which revolutionized working here and visiting here. It was, and still is, an opportunity to focus on individual objects and to see exhibitions, to see our visible storage area. So it was a major project. I was chief curator at that time. Don Friery was the executive director. Bill Flint and I were Bill was our architectural conservator. We were the staff reps. All the members of the curatorial department worked on it, so on and so forth. But when we were through, and we'd opened the exhibition on pursuing refinement in rural New England, which I curated and wrote a little catalog about. It's not that I was done with Deerfield, but I guess I just wondered what was next. Meanwhile, my friend and colleague Ron Hurst, who's the VP at Colonial Williamsburg, called and said, well, John Prown is leaving his position here as curator of furniture to go to the Chipstone Foundation. Do you know anyone who would like to be curator of furniture here at CW? And I looked out the window and I waited about 8 seconds and I said, yes, I think I might. How about me?
It sounds like the 90s were some heady, inspiring, and exciting times. It's hard for people like me who are maybe a bit newer to Deerfield to realize that things like the Williams House haven't always been like they are today. It's easy to think that it's just the way things have always been and will always be, when the reality is that it takes a lot of work to bring these projects into being and then to sustain them over the decades. On the other hand, there are some things that will indeed last forever, like Phil's new tattoo. That's right, there's a rumor going around Deerfield that Phil is thinking about getting a new tattoo when he retires, but he isn't sure what to get. So here's our chance to give him some more valuable retirement advice. When Phil retires, which tattoo should he get next? Is it A, a tall case clock on his left calf? Is it B, a map of the most inhabited parts of New England on his back? C, a pair of carved powder horns on his chest? Or D, the words rich and tasty in cursive on his forearms? Okay, I feel like I should really explain that last one. We just finished up with the 90s, but the book Rich and Tasty, Vermont Furniture to 1850, that Phil co-edited with Gene Burke and which was published by the Shelburne Museum, didn't actually hit bookshelves until 2015. So you're forgiven for thinking that that one was completely out of left field. Anyways, you know the drill. We'll give it a few more seconds for you to get your votes in. And don't forget to add your own advice for Phil and Betsy in the chat box. All right, votes are coming in fast. And it looks like a pair of carved powder horns on his chest. There you go, Phil. You've got a name for the band. You've got an idea for your next tattoo. All right, on to the 2000s.
And he did return to Historic Deerfield as president and CEO in 2003. His first brilliant move was to convince Betsy to marry him. With Betsy, the two make a formidable pair, spreading the word about Historic Deerfield on their trips across the country and abroad. Betsy's been an outstanding ambassador on behalf of Historic Deerfield, as well as a wonderful volunteer helping staff with education programs and special events. She's also a pretty amazing wreath maker too, helping to make beautiful handmade natural holiday wreaths for our annual winter display on the doors of the historic houses. Phil was successful in bringing the ADA Antique Show back to Deerfield, and we were all thrilled that this happened so soon after his return. To have one of the best antique show in Deerfield, Columbus Day weekend, was absolutely incredible. I hope one day it will return. 2004 marked the 300th anniversary of the 1704 raid on Deerfield. Historic Deerfield and the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association collaborated on an exhibition at the Flint Center called Remembering 1704, Context and Commemoration of the Deerfield Raid, that for the first time explored the raid from multiple perspectives, English, French, and Native American. Events were scheduled throughout the year, as well as on the actual anniversary of the raid that February, including an incredible summer weekend event that explored encounters between Native, English, and French people in Deerfield in the centuries after the 1704 raid. Throughout his career, Phil has added important objects to Historic Deerfield's collections, making it one of national significance. When Phil returned to Deerfield, he said that Historic Deerfield needed to continue to secure significant documented objects of national importance and exhibit them for the American public. In 2005, by far his most masterful addition was the William H. Guthman collection of American engraved powder horns, consisting of 75 pieces created between 1747 and 1781. The collection is described as the finest assemblage of this indigenous and unique colonial American art form. The horns are currently on display in the Flint Center exhibition, Engraved Powder Horns from the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. Phil was also committed to ensure that the content and quality of Historic Deerfield's award-winning magazine remained high, which it has, and to his credit, the magazine has remained ad-free. Let's hear from Phil and his colleagues about his time away from Historic Deerfield and his early years as president.
Went to Colonial Williamsburg and as the curator of furniture, and I had a great time there, great friends, colleagues still.
I actually had the privilege of being his supervisor, which felt very odd to me because I often felt like that he ought to be supervising me. Phil has that wonderful New England sardonic persona. And when Phil was preparing to come to work for Colonial Williamsburg, I was talking to a friend who had had a conversation with him the previous day. And he had said, you know, I'm pretty excited about this Colonial Williamsburg thing. And the friend said, for Phil, that was the equivalent of me doing cartwheels down the middle of the table. And it's so true. It's so true. We loved having Phil on the staff here. It was a great treat for all of us. And we hated to see him go, but he had bigger and better things to do, and he's done them.
Then I worked for Jane at the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now called Historic New England. And I was VP for museums and collections there for a couple of years more, and then came back here in 2003 as the CEO.
When we interviewed him, the Deerfield was not broken, but it needed some repair. And he had gained great experience of his years at Williamsburg and at Society for New England Antiquities. And he brought that to Deerfield, which we knew he would.
I'm glad I came back to Deerfield because at the end of the day, this has been the best place for me and my sense of what my skills are. With my affection for and interest in cultural history and the important messages that it has for today's life, this has been a great place to try to exercise those muscles. And not just me, our whole staff is good at it. And of course, that's another thing. You always want to go someplace where you know there's support for a great staff. And that's been the case here for as long as I've been associated.
Once Phil became president, of course, the whole responsibility was his as to how to develop the staff, to determine what new staff was needed, to move things in directions that they had not gone previously, to be much more open to a general public, to really actively develop programming and publicity that would increase visitation and develop strong membership and donor groups.
Phil has really worked hard to build this board and to create a body of individuals who hold fiduciary responsibility for the institution, but who do it out of love and passion for what the place represents. And Phil and Betsy both have a deep and special relationship with each of the trustees. And for me, that's been one of the most rewarding aspects of being involved in Historic Deerfield.
He was always fun to work with because he's very humorous. And trustees, I think, always find that a little surprising when they come on board, just how amusing he really is.
What challenges does anybody face in a leadership position? It's always about money and people and unexpected surprises.
We've had plenty of challenges and disasters to deal with over time. In fact, you might say that a disaster is part of the reason that the American public was or is introduced to this place through the colonial wars and all that's happened here when Deerfield was the northwesternmost point of the British Empire. So conflict between England and France defined those periods and defined some of the public's perception of this place, pro and con. I don't think history is linear. It's more like it's round somehow. And so my path is round. It's just kind of doubling back, which is to say, never burn your bridges because you might need one.
Let's keep this story moving right on into the 2010s.
The mark of a good leader is to rise in the face of a serious challenge, and Phil did that when Tropical Storm Irene came through Deerfield and caused catastrophic flood damage across the Deerfield River Valley. In advance of the storm's arrival, there were several different models for the hurricane's track, and meteorologists did not have a uniform opinion on what was going to happen. The museum closed early so staff could prep all the houses for the potential damage. Objects were removed from walls and placed in the center of each room. The staff also covered objects with plastic sheeting for protection. But as Amanda Lang, our curator of historic interiors, said, the prep did not include the scenario of water rushing across the street at the north end, which hadn't happened since the 1930s. Stormwater crossed Route 5 and 10 by both entrances to the street. The state police closed Route 5 and 10, and this prevented staff from getting to the museum. That left Phil and Betsy on their own to get to the Sheldon House and the Williams House in order to move the collections to the second floor. Luckily, there was no damage to the collections, but a couple of cellars flooded, causing damage to mechanical systems. The Deerfield Inn by far had the most severe damage and was closed for 19 months. Phil was now in the position to find funding for this massive renovation plan. Post-storm, Historic Deerfield received a National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation Assistance Grant to revise and enhance our emergency preparedness plan for collections, which included hands-on training from 2 conservators in wet salvage techniques. Phil successfully negotiated to have Historic Deerfield be the featured exhibition at the Philadelphia Antiques Show in 2014. This marked the first time that an institution outside of Pennsylvania was invited to participate in the nation's premier Americana Antique Show, and reinforced Historic Deerfield's position as one of the top museums of American decorative arts and history. The exhibition was titled Historic Deerfield, Art and Life in an Extraordinary New England Village, and it featured more than 30 objects, including furniture, textiles, ceramics, silver, maps, and paintings to convey ways in which refinement was expressed by people in the Connecticut River Valley during the 18th and 19th centuries. This was an adventure for the staff that traveled to Philadelphia to oversee the installation of the exhibition and to represent Historic Deerfield at the show. We rented a townhouse near the convention center so we could all be together in one location. We all knew how important this opportunity was for introducing Historic Deerfield to new constituencies. It was a great success and a lot of fun. Another great opportunity was when the editors of Martha Stewart Living magazine approached Historic Deerfield about publishing an 8-page article featuring the museum. Phil and the staff knew that this was a tremendous opportunity for raising national awareness and increasing attendance. Having the article published during the fall foliage season was an added bonus and helped increase visitation. It doesn't take long for people to realize how important sense of place is to Deerfield, starting with the Pecumtuck and their ancestors who lived here for over 12,000 years. At the heart of the sense of place is the land. Phil's collaborative work with the Deerfield Land Trust to protect and steward the surrounding farmland and landscape views should be recognized, commended, and continued as we move forward in the next phase of growth and enhanced awareness. What did I say earlier, that the mark of a good leader is the ability to rise up when facing a serious challenge? Well, COVID-19 provided Phil with yet another test of his leadership skills. He immediately established a COVID task force and got to work. Phil's a compassionate leader, and he did everything he could do to help keep staff safe and employed. I also want to recognize his support of the staff effort to shift our programs online. It was a risk worth taking, and we thank him for all his efforts on our behalf. Let's hear from Phil and his colleagues about opportunities and challenges he faced as president, as well as his efforts to bring back documented objects to Deerfield.
Phil is a team player, became more so more and more as he developed as an administrator, because he has really nurtured and built a strong staff and encouraged them to become individual specialists, provided them with outlets in terms of publication and exhibition and program opportunities to share and display what they have learned, and encourage them in new acquisitions and new research. And then there's the acts of God. And for Phil, it was unfortunately the huge flood that wiped out the Deerfield Inn, a major source of income, but actually turned out to be a gift in the way the inn was reimagined in its reconstruction and is now a popular local center and a great place to go.
I'll never forget August 31st, 2011, now virtually 10 years ago. So the flood, we were prepared, as we have been in the past, for a hurricane, but there wasn't any wind. It was all about a lot of water. And so once again, as they have through millennia, the meadows filled up with water almost instantly. By the end of it, I think there was about 14 feet of water out there. The street here was dissected into 2 islands, and that was basically the case for approaching a couple of days. Took out the Deerfield Inn at some considerable expense, filled 4 other cellars, and then it stopped raining.
The street was underwater and the Deerfield Inn was badly damaged, and Phil oversaw the restoration of the inn, the restoration of buildings in historic Deerfield that required special care, and really addressed a crisis in an extremely powerful way, one that resulted in Deerfield emerging as a stronger organization after the incident.
His expansion of the collections included things that were locally made, really a concerted effort to acquire documented objects that were known to have been made in the immediate Deerfield area, to gain back, they would say, return to Deerfield, things that had been owned by families on the street and were no longer there.
The Stebbins family clock is a great illustration of our collecting interests. So this clock, which was made in Boston about the year 1800 by Aaron Willard, was owned by the Stebbins family here in Deerfield and descended in the family until about 6 years ago, when it was consigned to Sotheby's in New York. Now, Don Frary, Peter Spang, and I had known about this clock for decades, but at the end of the day, they decided not to, the family decided not to contact us, but to send the clock to auction. So we wanted the clock here because it was among the original furnishings of the house built by Asa and Amelia Stebbins here in Deerfield, the brick one across from the Deerfield Inn. So when Asa Stebbins died in 1844, the clock was listed in the room-by-room probate inventory in the north parlor. So we knew in that Deerfield way quite specifically where the clock was. So I think we had 11 days to find the money to support the acquisition of this clock.
Under Phil's leadership, we created something called the Deerfield Collectors Guild. And over the course of roughly 2 weeks, some 60 people came together and raised the roughly $300,000 that was required to bring that clock back to Deerfield. So when the clock was restored and then brought back to Deerfield, the question was, well, where in the house should we put it? And Phil looked around the room and said, well, I think it probably belongs in that corner over there. And it just seems like the place that a clock would be. And so they moved the clock into position.
And there were a couple of screw holes in the back of the case, because you want to secure a clock like that, because when the weights are wound up, it's pretty top heavy, and this is a tall clock. So we had a pencil, marked the wall, moved the case out of the way, got the drill, and drilled directly into a filled hole. So I am sure, because this hole is not where you'd hang a picture or anything, I am sure that we literally put that clock right back where it was in the first part of the 19th century. No, there's no question in my mind. And that's what's so great about Deerfield. It's if you want to explore a sense of place and how places work, on the strength of that clock alone, you should come to Deerfield.
And since the formation of the Deerfield Collectors Guild, we have brought a number of Deerfield-made and owned objects back to Deerfield. Again, another example of Phil's very clever thinking and creative fundraising.
The clock probably left Deerfield, left that house, I think we figured in the 1870s. Family sold the house and traveled with it and then consigned it to Sotheby's. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
The other area that Phil has really contributed to is land conservation. Under Phil's leadership, Historic Deerfield has established a collaborative relationship with the Franklin Land Trust, which seeks to preserve the landscape surrounding Deerfield, in particular the North Meadows, where significant land ownership remains in private hands. And Phil has done a remarkable job of partnering with the Franklin Land Trust to ensure that that landscape is and viewshed are preserved for future generations.
And then I guess the last big challenge, of course, has been COVID-19. Who could miss that since we're still living with it? I just came out of the blue last March, just about a year ago. And the department heads and the staff, we closed the whole operation down, the museum, the inn, the whole thing, in just 3 or 4 days' time. It's like a bad submarine movie where they go, dive, dive, dive. And so down we went. We closed all the valves. We reopened the inn 3 months later. The museum reopened Labor Day on a much condensed version. And now, of course, we're gearing up to reopen the museum this time around on Memorial Day weekend.
As we've learned through the COVID pandemic, there is an emerging appreciation of digital content delivery. Our team at Historic Deerfield was very forward-thinking and embraced that technology, and embraced it in a way that enabled us to expand our audiences. And I feel that the future holds a lot of promise in that area. The other thing that Phil has commenced under his leadership, and where we have tremendous opportunity, is a project that we call Lost Voices, which is focusing on underrepresented voices that can tell important stories about Deerfield. That would include the Native American populations that coexisted in and around Deerfield, as well as African American community, which formed a significant part of Deerfield's population in the 18th century.
The Native community is very important to Historic Deerfield. For one thing, this is their place before anyone else. The Pocumtuck's been here for a mere 10 to 12,000 years. And so the deep history of what is now called Deerfield is critical. It's valued, cherished space, and the Native contributions have to be understood to understand the contributions of anyone who's come after.
Phil is a remarkable leader. What I enjoy the most about working with Phil is that he is a strategic visionary. Phil is down to earth. He is brilliant. He has a sensibility that appreciates history and what it can teach us. He's also got a great sense of humor, a dry New England sense of humor, and he has become one of my closest friends.
I don't really have all that many amusing stories, but I have some very keen observations based on personal experience. Phil has tiny feet and is easy to tip over. So Phil tipping is not really a sport. And he's also the sworn mortal enemy of the woodchuck in a sort of Carl Spackler gopher Caddyshack kind of way. If you're a woodchuck and you're on the Zea Ranch, you're fixing to get some good country justice.
Well, what comes next? Rumor has it around Deerfield that Phil is considering writing a book. That's right, he's writing another book, as if Rich and Tasty wasn't satisfying enough for him. It seems he's struggling to settle on a topic, though. So I thought that perhaps we could all help him out by voting on a title. This is our last poll of the night, so make it count. What is the title for Phil's next book? Is it 1001 Uses for a Salmon Gig? Is it Pursuing Retirement in Rural New England? Or how about C? It's Hard on the Knees, the Phil Zea Guide to Appreciating Early American Furniture. Or maybe D, Hadley Chests, My First True Love. Pay close attention, Phil. I think we have some real winners in here. The votes are piling in. We'll give it a few more seconds. Oh, and don't forget to add your suggestions for Phil in the comments, the chat box there. And there we go. It's Hard on the Knees, the Phil Zea Guide to Appreciating Early American Furniture. There we are, folks. With that and a new band and an appointment for a new tattoo, Phil should have plenty to do to keep busy in retirement. All kidding aside, it has been incredibly rewarding for me to have had an opportunity to work closely with Phil over the past several years. We've had a lot of laughs and we've logged a lot of miles on the road, and with Betsy on many of those trips too. Together, they have inspired me and countless others to more fully appreciate the artifacts of the past, while also internalizing and accepting the deep responsibility that we all bear for ensuring that those artifacts remain intact and accessible for future generations to study and enjoy. I cannot thank Phil and Betsy enough for the invaluable knowledge and experience that I have gained from them. I know that they are looking forward to retirement and have certainly earned it. In our final segment tonight, we'll give a bit more airtime to Phil and our guests as they explore topics like Phil's legacy, Phil and Betsy's presence on the street, and the ways in which they have so deeply connected with folks over the years, and what really lies in store for Phil when he retires. This section's a little bit longer, so settle in, but I think you'll agree with me that it's worth it.
The 1973 version of Phil Zea, he needed a lot of work, for one thing. So what the current version would say to him is how unbelievably surprising this has all turned out based on your performance back in those days. But I do think that a love of the material, a fascination with the past and its mysteries and how you research and find things out and how you put two and two together has made both vocation and avocation the same. I'm not sure any of this is anything that I've done. It's more how I've responded to my mentors. It's hard to imagine because that's virtually 50 years ago. My wife, Betsy, has been just fabulous through this whole adventure here in Deerfield, for me the second time. She loves Deerfield, and she's done a lot of volunteer work for Historic Deerfield and is a great ambassador in her own right, in many regards better than I am.
She's a wonderful entertainer. She's a little Southern, and they're very hospitable, and that's Betsy.
The thing that makes Phil and Betsy such a great pair is that they really are a team. Love each other, love Historic Deerfield, love American material culture, and are both interested in seeing that subject grow.
Betsy is a huge part of the warmth and the hospitality that Deerfield represents to so many visitors. Phil and Betsy are beloved by all of the trustees. They're two very special people who both contribute immensely to the success of Historic Deerfield.
Nothing is forever, so we have to be prepared to leave when we can, and a lot of times you've got to leave so you can come back. I've already done that once, so I know that it's possible to extract yourself from a place that you care about and come back. And that's true for Betsy too. So we've got to reinvent ourselves a little bit. We've got to move on for the betterment of the organization, but we won't be too far away.
I'm energized when I think about the future of Historic Deerfield. It's a highly successful, highly impactful institution that has just weathered a very serious storm with the pandemic, learning to operate in new ways, learning to deliver content in new and creative ways. And I think that Phil leaves an organization that can now be taken to its next level of impact and success.
Phil built on those foundations and carried them on up. And so he's put the next generation in a great position to keep going with new and more diverse questions about these topics. I mean, his research is the last word on most of those subjects. So it's there for the ages in the libraries, on the bookshelves.
When I think of Phil, I think of Emerson. And he has said, the institution is the long shadow of the man. And Historic Deerfield certainly has become the long shadow of Phil.
I think what I love the most about Deerfield, not to be overly dramatic, but are the shadows. And what I'm getting at is, because this is a real place in history, with the human imprint all over it for generations upon generations, all of us through time have left their mark on the landscape. So if you have been here to Deerfield and walked the street, early morning, late afternoon, and to catch that raking light, you know what I'm talking about, because there are all these bumps and divots and damage even that that make up this landscape that has literally supported all of us for thousands of years. So that gives it a kind of spiritual presence that is quite unlike most places. That's all because of the shadows that mark the place where you've been and the places where all those other people have gone to. And you don't get that just anywhere, but you do here.
What Phil has really done is, through his leadership, he has contributed to an understanding of Deerfield as a place that is authentic, that is real, that delivers the story of America. And I think that taking it from what once was just a collection of historic houses with interesting objects in them and bringing it to that higher level of appreciation is Phil's greatest legacy.
Now that Phil is going to be retired, I hope he has more time to do research and write on the subjects that he loves, because there's no one better at doing that.
He will be remembered by his publications. He's a wonderful writer. And he's going to be working on a book about our powderhorn collection in his retirement. So I'm looking forward to that.
I was delighted to hear that he had agreed to stay on as a special project to work on a study of the citizen soldiers as seen through the powderhorn collection of Bill Guthman, and to develop a book and an exhibition related to that. It's one of Phil's own intellectual interests and scholarly specialties. It's something he will do better than anyone ever could.
Phil has in mind a project to, for the first time, really take a deep dive into the scholarship around these unique objects and to develop a catalog and eventually a traveling exhibition that will showcase these amazing works of art and also explore what it meant to be a citizen soldier in the 18th century. So I think Phil will not go too far. We will maintain an association with him and continue to work with him on that project.
Any good curator at heart is always going to be about the objects. So it's great for him that he's going to have this time. I look forward to reading the outcome of his new work.
I'm very happy for Phil. Want nothing but the best for him.
I just would like to thank Phil personally for his friendship and for this great time that we've had working together as a board with him as president and stewarding the important place that is Historic Deerfield.
As a CEO, whether you're here for a year or for 18 years, we're all interim, and you have to keep yourself in perspective. So I hope that I've made a difference in that I've charted at least a viable plan for how to preserve this place and then how to utilize it going forward.
We do thank Phil for his incredible contribution during his tenure at Historic Deerfield. There's really no way to sum it up. It is so varied and so deep and touches each aspect of Historic Deerfield, not just as an institution, but as a place. And we will be forever indebted to Phil for what he's done for the institution. His mark is indelible and will always be remembered as being a high point in this organization's history.
At the end of the day, the importance of Deerfield has to do with the people who I've had a chance to work with, past and present, because it's really an amazing group with all kinds of intertwinings among them too, so that there's a real fabric to the sense of community here in Deerfield. Most people really do love to work here. It's a beautiful place, but it also has a clear mission and a purpose that melds us all together. So I'm sorry in some ways to leave daily access to that behind. But as I said earlier, sometimes you've got to leave to come back. So that's what we'll do.
And I hope he takes time for some real leisure. Because I know, for one thing, Phil loves Paris. And I have an image of him and Betsy sitting in front of a nice little brasserie with matching Breton striped shirts, maybe a beret, drinking chill rosé and eating stinking cheese.
I wish it could go on forever. And in just a couple of days, you will be the senior-most member of the Historic Deerfield staff. Are there any thoughts you would like to share?
I've known Phil for 35 years as a friend, a colleague, and as my supervisor. He is extraordinarily generous with his time. His contributions to Historic Deerfield in the field are significant and will be long-lasting. And as you would imagine, Phil has always been a great mentor. He has helped so many people, in particular students in the summer fellowship program, staff, and colleagues outside of Deerfield. He gave the staff room to take some risks, in particular when we took the Dwight House offline as a house museum and created the Apprentices Workshop there, an interactive experience where visitors can learn about raw materials, tools and techniques for making objects, and the skill sets of the artisans that produce them. He made sure that each issue of the Historic Deerfield magazine was better than the one before. We need to continue this tradition of high quality, content-rich publications and programs. Phil's the first one to say that the successes at Historic Deerfield are a team sport, and we all do work well as a team. Now the team looks forward to being of assistance to Phil as he works on creating a traveling exhibition and catalog for the Powderhorn collection. And lastly, we want Phil to continue to keep an eye out for great objects for us and to keep adding to his master list of the best diners on the East Coast. Onward, Phil and Betsy. Before we bring this evening to a close, I'm so very pleased to invite Phil back on screen for one last curtain call, and live this time, tuning in from a comfortable spot somewhere in the recesses of the Dickinson House. Ladies and gentlemen, Historic Deerfield's newly crowned President Emeritus, Philip Zea.
Well, that is beyond overwhelming. Usually I'm not at a loss of words, but I haven't even started and I'm at a loss of words. But I do know that myth making is a federal crime. And so there's some people who are in big trouble. I do want to, in that vein though, add a couple editorial comments just to put things right. One is I certainly didn't raise all the money for the Flint Center 25 years ago. That was Don Friery, and we all worked together on that, but he led the charge. And the other thing is when the Deerfield River decided to call on the Deerfield Inn and destroy it. Bill Flint really led the charge as the kind of clerk of the works who brought that back and made it functional 19 months later. So again, we all worked on it, but it's important that that we set the record straight, because this is the best documented small town in America. So we have to have the facts. Now, I was completely in the clouds on this one. I had no idea what was going on, so I'll get even with people later. But I do want to thank some folks. One, of course, is filmmaker Ron Fulton, who we've worked together, all of us here, with Ron on several projects, and I think you'll agree he's absolutely fabulous. I asked Lori Nivison, who's our director of marketing, for a little advice on who I can blame. I don't mean blame, I mean thank. So one thing I got out of her are simply some trustees and old friends. I do want to thank in particular Jesse Vanek, who I'll deal with later, Ann Lanning, who's always so gracious and supportive, but also cutting edge in her own right. Lori, who is always in the background, Lori Nivison. In fact, she's here even now in the background. Jessica Schofield, Penny Leverett. This was quite a committee that has been entirely successful in deeply embarrassing me, but I appreciate it. Anyway, so the point, though, is that it's really not about me, and it's, Betsy would agree with this, it's not so much about us. It honestly is about Historic Deerfield, and maybe more specifically, but in a broad way, Deerfield itself. There is no place quite like this. It's a unique combination at a high level of cultural assets of the sort that we all love, and that frame a beautiful afternoon walk or a deep dive into one kind of object or the other, or the place. I mentioned that it's the best documented small town in America. That's really the foundation that includes archaeology and all these assets. So that's what it's all about. It's not about us. It's about using Deerfield for enjoyment and for education. And we, Betsy and I, really can't thank everyone enough over the ages. And imagine, I had a chance to work here not once, but twice. I mean, that's just amazing for 36 of my, however many, 45 or 6 years in the business. So thank you. I suspect there's only about 3 people left in the audience now, but I do want to thank you anyway for sticking with us and everything that was said this evening. It really is overwhelming, and thanks for the opportunity to be so nicely embarrassed. So I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Phil, truly, for all that you and Betsy have done for Historic Deerfield, and for sharing your talents, humor, and wisdom with all of us. We wish you all the best as you head off into retirement, and we very much look forward to seeing you on the street again soon. And thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us on this special night. We will leave the chat open for up to 10 more minutes, and we hope to chat with you in Deerfield sometime as well. Take care.